And that there were lots of. There were, you must remember that by this time there were no young men in Germany. They were either dead or in prison camps. Before we got into the war, I drove a guy up into Canada to Cranbrook, BC. And at this time, of course, Canada was in the war, and they had drafted all the young men around. And you go into town, and there were no young men. It was absolutely amazing. Well, the same thing was going on in Germany. They were only worse there because there were men, a few, but there were no young men. I have pictures of these women out in the fields, in the farm fields. We'll show you here. But there were no young men in Germany. Anyway, the officers in Austria, headquarters battery had acquired von Ribbentrop's Mercedes limousine that they used in parades and whatever. And this Mercedes was the same as Hitler's, except that it wasn't armored. Still, it weighed 9,000 pounds. And when the general wasn't around, of which I never saw, the officers would use it to go out and have fun. One night, a bunch of them had me drive them around various places. I don't remember what they were doing, but before I left, I gassed it up. But on the way back, I ran out of gas. I had already dropped the officers off at their quarters by this time. Limousine. On the trip to Europe, when we took Frank Brown, we went to Melsungen and Darmstadt. Melsungen, the day we went up there on the train, we didn't have a lot of time. We were only going to have a couple hours there, and it was cold and it was miserable, so that was not a pleasant time. We stayed, I went to the Kaserne in Darmstadt, and we had our pictures taken with a soldier there who was kind of our guide. There was still no radio job open for me, so I continued to drive. Kassel, and the artillery headquarters was in the Kaserne there at Darmstadt. Occasionally I would have to go up to headquarters or up in some of the areas where perhaps the battalions were occupying the area. One time when I was driving the 1942 Buick, I thought I'd see how fast it would go. So I put it on the floor, and it got up to 92 miles an hour. Well, I figured, well, see, the freeways are clear, no traffic, occasional bomb crater that had been filled in. But I was going along at 92 miles an hour, figure I had the road to myself, and all of a sudden I heard something trying to pass me. Well, that scared me, because at 92, what would pass me at that speed? Then I looked up, and a P-38 just zoomed over me as if he was on a strafing run. Good thing it wasn't during the war. That would have been it. And another time, I thought I'd see how far, or how, it was about 120 miles from Frankfurt to Kassel. I thought I would see how fast a Jeep would go and how long I could keep my foot on the floor. So I floored the throttle, and 67 miles an hour as fast as that Jeep could go. So driving that Buick that fast, I'm not sure was a really smart idea, because who knows how old those tires were. I was able to keep my foot on the floor for about 30 minutes before I had to take it off. One time, the colonel was having trouble, maybe this was later, anyway, he was having trouble finding someone to mend or modify his uniform. I was a driver. Yeah, I was still his driver. I was just standing by while these officers discussed, how are they going to find out how to get this uniform fixed. So what I could do about it. So, of course, what I did, went to the nearest German and asked him, hey, you got any tailors around here? So I went back to him about an hour later and said, yeah, there's this tailor over here in this town nearby. He said, how did you find out? I said, oh, well, ask questions. Anyway, he probably raised his esteem of me rose at that, although I don't know why. A very simple solution to the problem. Maybe they didn't want to talk to the Germans. They've been fighting them for so many years. The room we had there in Melsungen didn't have a shower, so we would have to go across the river on this bridge that Bill Blake is waiting for me to take his picture, where there were showers. Well, now we were done doing what we were to do up in Melsungen, so now they're going to move the headquarters battery of artillery down to Darmstadt. That's about 15 miles south of Frankfurt. And at this time, Patton was still alive. Army headquarters was down in Heidelberg. He hadn't been killed yet. But I found that I'd accumulated so much stuff that I couldn't carry it all at one load when we were to go. So I went to the officer who was handling this thing, and I asked him, I can't carry everything in one load, can I make an extra trip? So, okay. So I went down, took a load of stuff to Darmstadt, and where Blake and I had a room there. Patton also wanted to go to Moscow. He didn't like the communists, and they didn't. Bureaucrats and politicians didn't like Patton either, because to keep government going, he wanted to hire the National Socialists that had been running the country, and of course the politicians and bureaucrat wanted to fire him and put anti-Nazis in that position. In the Melsungen area, there was a place that had its own Frankenstein's castle. Not the same one in the movie, I'm sure. In May, when I left, May of '46, they were still denazifying the Germans. Several months after the war, we were still eating imitation coffee. The rumor was that the cooks were trading it to the Fräuleins. During this time, they started sending officers back to the States. Whether they would be discharged or reassignment, I don't know, but that's when I had the job of driving them to Le Havre. On the road from Germany to Le Havre through Paris, when necessary, the Army would have these gas stations where you could get oil and gas. I don't remember what other supplies. But I made a number of trips there because there was still no radio operator's job open. We were doing everything but what an Army ordinarily does. We were trying to manage the millions of homeless, displaced people. We did no training. We were trying to see that the Germans weren't stocking up and getting ready to do partisan warfare, but everything but train as an army. I drove the Mercedes one time while we were, I had a spare driver in this case, and he was sitting in the back seat, and I didn't know it, but the cover over this was the general's car, the cover over the star had come off, and these guys were saluting, and we couldn't figure out why. How come all these guys are saluting us? Maybe that they can see that star, and this guy in the back, he was just a private, so he got a big kick out of this. American prisoners, civilly, and there was not a lot of dying of starvation by American prisoners, but as it was, the prisoners were eating about the same as the civilian population was doing. Surveys showed that the death rate in German prison camps for Allied prisoners, like in England and the United States, died at about the same rate as the general population in Germany. The United States and England had signed the Geneva Convention. The Japanese ignored that totally, and the death rate in the Japanese prison camps was just absolutely horrible. I had a friend who was a pilot in China during the war, and he hated the Japanese till his dying day. On one of the trips, I was driving a Jeep. That was with Bill Blake on this trip. And on the way back, of course, we always stopped in Paris for a day or two. I mean, after all, they didn't know how long we were going to be. But anyway, we weren't supposed to leave the vehicle unattended. We figured, well, we'll foil these car thieves by taking the rotor out of the... Sure enough, when we came back out, there was no Jeep there, so we found the MP place, and yeah, I said, we got your Jeep. The rotors, those things were a dime a dozen in Paris, so we learned our lesson there, I guess.